In honor of Denver's decriminalization of magic mushrooms, doctors of Reddit, what, if any, is your best story of patients on hallucinogenics? Was working night shift on inpatient service. ED called to admit someone. We've got a 17-year-old down here with altered mental status. We think he needs to be admitted for eval monitoring. VSS, chem fine, etc etc. Now, I'm not a pediatrician. I don't do kids. I don't understand why the ED is calling me. But, I'm an intern, and it's 2 in the morning, so arguing about it is stupid. I headed to the ED. I get there to see a young dude sitting there with his parents. I'll mention that his dad was a full bird colonel and very much fit the archetype, and his mom seemed to fit that type of personality too. The kid is literally rolling around in his bed, alternating between crying, asking if he was going to die, rubbing his dad's hand, and telling him how much he loved him. I had to sit there and take a history with a straight face from a 17-year-old who kept being distracted by just how much he loved his dad. I think my first question was, did you take anything tonight? And he was straight up and said, oh yeah, like a shit ton of acid. Want any? I 100% laughed at this statement. His dad was not amused. The patient was discharged the next morning. It was nice of him to offer to share. At least that gives them a sample for the lab, to make sure it's actually what he thinks it is, and not mixed with whatever. I had a guy who was freaking out thinking he was going to die because he thought he had eaten too many hallucinogenic mushrooms. He went online and saw that sometimes patients are given activated charcoal to soak up the mushrooms in the stomach. Not entirely true, by the way. So he goes outside and starts chowing down on charcoal briquettes that he has in his garage for grilling. After about a dozen he realizes, holy shit, I'm eating charcoal briquettes. Now he is really freaking out, so he grabs his dog, as he thinks he is never coming back to his house, and drives himself to the ED. He parks out front, walks into Tridge with the pup, black charcoal all over his face and hands, and says, I need a doctor and someone to watch my dog when I die. That's actually really considerate of the dog, if he was worried that nobody else would show up to take care of it in time following his demise. Yeah, dog was a bro for driving him to the ED. That guy had his priorities set. One of the benefits of hallucinogens, you tend to cling to what's important while you're being fired through the galactic pinhole. Had a friend become impatient with mushrooms once. He took an eighth, and an hour later decided they weren't very strong. So the most logical thing to do would be eat his other eighth. Cut to 2 hours later, and he is parked on top of a parking garage. Tried to drive across town when they kicked in, and he immediately realized his fuck up. He tried to wait it out, but after being abandoned by everyone else, I wasn't around. No way in hell would I have left the poor guy on 7 grams of shrooms to his own devices, and he decides he needs help. So he calls 911. While on the phone he wants to be as honest as possible, so he tells them about his .22 caliber rifle behind the seat of his truck. Only it comes out as, there's a gun in the car. He says he was tripping and sweating so badly, it was July. The next thing he remembers is hearing a tink 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 and looking up to being surrounded by police, guns drawn and ready for anything. Friend isn't in danger though, so they get him in an ambulance, and give him charcoal to induce vomiting. The rest of the night is a blur for him, and he wakes up cuffed to the bed. They ask him if there's anyone he can call for a ride, and he tells them his mom is a nurse who works on the 2nd floor. Apparently while tripping he kept telling them to go upstairs and get mom, so they all have a chuckle realizing his mom really was upstairs. Oh god, nightmare scenario. Out in public with a car on 7 grams. Dude, I couldn't tell you where my left hand was, on 7 grams of shrooms, much less my mother. I was a doctor that was on rotation in the emergency department. 33-year-old male who was brought in naked by the police, under the influence of suspected mushroom ingestion. He had a bit of trouble understanding why he'd been arrested, despite being very aware of the fact that he'd been caught gallivanting around naked in the rain in a children's playground. The initial police response had been with 2 officers, and he told me with glee that they weren't able to grab him because he was slippery like an oiled pig in the rain, and the nakedness didn't help with no clothing for them to grab. Due to being unable to catch him, they called for dog squad backup. He recounted with a shit-eating grin how he'd hidden inside a giant puddle like Rambo and had thrown sticks and rocks to confuse the police dog. Following an hour or so, they gave up and reverted to using a search line of 12 police slowly advancing to find him. Eventually one stumbled into this goblin's little swamp puddle, and then they took another 15 minutes trying to catch him as he bolted naked around the children's playground, again. His only regret, despite his wife refusing to come and pick him up from the hospital, was that he hadn't eaten more shrooms. Edit, I'm glad this story is brightening a few days. Thank you for the silvers and golds. To his fans, I'm sure he's somewhere out there to this very day, naked, slippery, and plotting his revenge. This is my favorite story here, thanks. Nurse here. Used to work the night shift in a very small, rural ED in North Carolina. We had a couple in their 20s get picked up the local police. They were found in their car stopped on the train tracks looking very lost and confused. They had somehow made it from Raleigh and were attempting to get to the beach. We don't know exactly when they decided to take the LSD. So they are brought into the emergency department for an eval before they are let go. This being rural North Carolina, no one had a clue about how to handle this type of situation. We basically gave them IV fluids, put them on cardiac monitors, and tried not to stimulate them too much. They were extremely polite, and since I was the closest in age to them and had some experience with recreational drugs, I did my best to engage them. As I was starting an IV on the male partner, I asked how he was feeling. Very safe, he replied. His pupils were as wide as saucers. I miss that job sometimes. This is actually really sweet. One of my medications causes my eyes to dilate, like to the point where my iris is just a thin ring, and I'm always confused when people mention large pupils until I remember that that is not, in fact, a normal thing. What medication is that? In my town, you'd be fucked trying to go to any bar. I had a patient who had taken an ungodly amount of Benadryl in a failed suicide attempt. A lot of people think that since it makes you drowsy, a bunch of it might be able to kill them in their sleep. Instead of killing them though, Benadryl basically gives you absolutely terrifying hallucinations for like 24 hours or more and then leaves you with the worst multi-day hangover you have ever had in your life. He would not stop yelling and screaming about that damn cat poking its head out of the ceiling tiles every single time I left the room. He also had short bursts of thinking he was covered in bugs and I would find him stripped naked and yelling into the wall. Fucking ceiling cat, he sees you every time. He was very upset that we had put him in the cat room. Did you tell him you had no choice? You had to place him right meow? I'm a paramedic but this story is from back when I was an EMT, hand holder, oxygen giver, bandage distributor. Got called at night for a teenage male who had ingested mushrooms. On the way to the call, my paramedic partner was unusually silent. After a while she pipes up, I don't get it. He ate mushrooms. Like, what? Portobello's. She grew up very sheltered in the country. So that's how this was gonna go. We get there, and the cops walk out a skinny kid wearing only boxers. Took some shrooms. First time ever. Freaked out and told his parents who called 911. My partner is spinning in circles and asking whether she should call poison control. I help the kid into the ambulance and onto the stretcher, turn the lights down low and tell my partner just to drive to the hospital. The kid is calming down a bit but he's tripping pretty hard. Asking if his parents are Jesus and stuff like that. This was before smartphones when iPods were the shit. I had one of those radio transmitters you could plug into the iPod and then play music through the vehicle speakers. It had a remote that I carried on my belt along with a clicker for the ambulance. We were going to the hospital, lights down low, just being chill when I remembered what my partner and I had been listening to a couple hours before when we checked our equipment. Thievery Corporation. So I reached down and hit the remote without him noticing. A few seconds go by and he turns to me with the widest eyes I've ever seen. Whoa. What? Is this music? He was in true bliss. He kept asking me about the music for the rest of the ride. We dropped him off and I wrote "Listen to Thievery Corporation" on a sheet of paper and tucked it into the waistband of his boxers. I like to think there's some dude out there from upstate New York who fell in love with thievery in high school but doesn't really know why. Oh, he definitely knew. Shrooms don't cause memory loss like alcohol does. I am a medic. Was working a concert in Chicago at Northerly Island a few years back for Fish Fest. Get a call for a male with his face in the ground. Find a shirtless 20-something-year-old with his pants undone and digging his face into the sand. I get next to the guy and tap his shoulder. Say, "Sir, do you know what's going on? Are you okay?" To which he responds in the most classic stoner voice, "Do you know what's going on, man?" And digs his face back in the sand with the stoniest of smiles you can imagine. We coax him out of the sand pit and he tells us he took 10. Just 10. Couldn't remember what of, just 10. And honestly 10 is a bad number of anything. Lol. 10 tabs of acid, 10 grams of weed, 10 grams of mushrooms, 10 shots, 10 heroines please. So we let him sit in the drunk tank with the rest of the Trip Tower goons. God bless their trippy little hearts. Do you know what's going on, man? Shit. I never really thought about it that way.